Let's take a look now at the airspace to the east of BTG, which is the battleground VORTAC, and take a look at Gimme intersection. And the question is, what is the minimum altitude for crossing Gimme intersection? In this case, you have an interesting situation on the MEAs. You have directional minimum en route altitudes. If you're flying this airway and you're going eastbound on it, the minimum en route altitude is 7,000 feet. On the other hand, if you're going westbound, the minimum en route altitude is 6,500 feet. And that's shown by these little arrows attached to the minimum en route altitudes. So if you're crossing Gimme, which as you can see is an altitude change point, and you're going eastbound, the minimum altitude to cross is 7,000 feet, which is probably due to higher terrain to the east. Let's take a look now at a slightly different situation in the Cedar City, Utah area. Let's assume that you started up here in the upper left-hand corner of this figure at the Milford VOR, and you're going to be flying this airway, Victor 235, down to the Cedar City VOR, and then flying eastbound here on Victor 293 over to Bryce Canyon. And the question is, what altitude are you going to cross Cedar City VOR at? Well, the minimum en route altitude between Milford and Cedar City is 10,000 feet. The minimum en route altitude once you've passed Cedar City VOR and you're eastbound on Victor 293 is 13,000 feet. Well, the normal way to make that altitude change is to start climbing to the new MEA after you cross the fix. But sometimes things are different in areas of high terrain. Notice on the Cedar City VOR, there's a flag coming right out of the VOR symbol with an X inside of it. Well, the lines forming the letter X cross. So when you see that flag with an X, think crossing. The flag with the X means that there's a published minimum crossing altitude, or MCA, at Cedar City. The minimum crossing altitude is the lowest altitude at which an aircraft can cross that fix when flying in the direction of a higher MEA. What that flag with the X means is you need to start your climb to the higher MEA before you cross this particular fix and be at or above the specified minimum crossing altitude before you cross the fix. And where do you find the minimum crossing altitude? At nav aids, intersections, and waypoints where there's an X shown coming right up out of the fix. Now in the case of a VOR, you're going to find the minimum crossing altitude printed below the identification box. Below the Cedar City VOR identification box, it says MCA, and it lists minimum crossing altitudes depending on the route of flight. The direction corresponds to the direction you're leaving the fix. In this particular case, you're leaving the fix on Victor 293 eastbound. Since you're leaving the fix on 293 going eastbound, the minimum crossing altitude is 12,000 feet. If you were leaving it on Victor 235 going southbound, the minimum crossing altitude would be 11,400 feet. So what that means is, flying in from the north, if you were at the MEA of 10,000 feet, you'd start a climb before you got to the Cedar City VOR and cross it at or above 12,000 feet. Then continue your climb to the new MEA of 13,000 feet, which is the MEA between Cedar City and Bryce Canyon. Now, if it was an intersection, you'd find the minimum crossing altitude printed right with the intersection name, like this example of the Casta intersection on Victor 23. If you're leaving this fix northwest bound, you can see you must be at 8,300 feet MSL or higher. Minimum crossing altitudes are not published because of traffic, but because there's rocks on the other side of that fix. So you definitely want to not violate the minimum crossing altitudes, and it's vitally important to maintain your own situational awareness. Now normally the controller's going to be way ahead of you, but don't bet your life on it. The controller should assign you an altitude that enables you to meet the minimum crossing altitude and subsequent MEA requirements. In this case, you would expect a clearance that gives you the ability to climb to the charted altitude minimums well prior to CASTA. And while the controller may issue CASTA minimum crossing altitude as a restriction, His or her only responsibility is to clear you to an altitude at or above the MCA. You, the pilot, are responsible for meeting the minimum crossing altitude restriction on the chart. So if you're flying along and because you're situationally aware, you realize you need to climb because of the rocks, call ATC and ask for a higher altitude. If you don't get an answer and the situation's becoming urgent, invoke lost comm procedures and climb to meet the minimum crossing altitude and MEA. Then continue to broadcast on the frequency in the blind until you reestablish radio contact with ATC.